All right, we are live, I believe. Hello, everybody. Welcome. If you guys are new here, I assume most of you are. Welcome to the channel. I've actually been waiting for this moment for a very, very long time. I've been following this guy who's on the other side of the screen to me for a very long time as well. Rob, for those of people who don't know who you are, I assume most people know who you are. But for those who are unenlightened, why don't you just tell us who you are, what you do, and what your goal is?
Sure. So I am in this weird little transition phase in my life right now. So in February of this year, 2023, I just left my law firm, exited my law firm. We built a very nice criminal defense law firm, Scottsdale, Arizona, grew a big, nice team there. And we were helping good people charged with crimes defend themselves against criminal charges. And during my time there, COVID hit, and prior to COVID, I was doing a lot of public speaking. I was going around trying to grow our law firm, sort of doing, brick and mortar business type stuff. COVID hit and it really deviated my entire strategy, deviated our entire business. We were helping people who were out, at bars, getting in trouble, having fun, going out and doing things. And when the whole world shut down, we were thinking that was the end of our business. That's the end of our livelihood. And so I was, not only a little bit freaked out for our business, also freaked out for our country, freaked out with what I was seeing with everybody just locking stuff down, these 14 days to slow the spread and everything. And so had a little bit of a pivot, and I decided to start pursuing YouTube more fully. And we started the show called Watching the Watchers. And that show started March 2020. I was already creating some content on YouTube just for criminal defense cases, kind of doing these videos on how to defend against this, or what to do when the prosecutor hides that, or all of these different kind of technical videos just for our law firm. But then it pivoted, and I started believing that I needed to start, standing up for something, speaking out for something. And COVID was the big impetus. And so Watching the Watchers live started on Wednesdays, March 2020, and it slowly, started to grow. I really, developed this platform into, sort of a new passion of mine where I could do research and share ideas. And, it really started to resonate with people. I mean, there were, surprisingly a lot of other people out there who were just as horrified as what we were seeing as I was. And so the show started to grow. Eventually it started to, stuff really got bad during COVID. So the show went live every day. We transitioned into, 5 days a week. And then that's what we've been doing. That's what I've been doing here for the last several years since COVID. And then in February, my business partner and I, we sat down, we took a look at our law firm, we took a look at, the paths on our lives, and we just made the decision that it makes more sense for him to take the keys of the law firm and run that, and to allow me to, venture out and go and do this type of work. So that happened in February. And since then, I've been sort of in year one of rebuilding this kind of a new business, a new venture with all of my heart, all of my passion, which is Watching the Watchers live. We go live 5 days a week. We have a members community, and the focus of the show is really shining a big, beautiful spotlight. Our values on the show are accountability, transparency, and justice. And we're always trying to create content that facilitates that effort while we're focusing on prosecutors, police prosecutors, and politicians. And so we sort of keep it focused on that area. But we cover a bunch of the stuff, that I think you talk about on your channel, a lot of this burgeoning government, this massive bureaucracy, the problems with the DOJ, the FBI, political lawfare, warfare. It just goes, there's no list, no problem finding stuff to talk about. So that's where we're at now. I'm not practicing law as a lawyer anymore, but I'm still licensed in Arizona and California. And so we take a very defense-oriented approach, a very, freedom-oriented approach. I'm always questioning the government, always questioning the prosecutors, and trying to be useful out there in this country.
All that's very healthy, by the way, and it's very necessary. It's why I support what you and a bunch of other law tubers do, because you guys kind of defy the current orthodoxy within American law, which is enshrined in the ABA, which is decidedly a left-wing outlet right now, which has no problem pushing some of the most egregious things in our justice system. And so there's a lot we can get into. But let's talk about, you talked about how you started off as a defense lawyer. So you've been on the other side of the aisle in the courtroom against prosecutors, many folks don't realize this, but many of whom actively conspire against the interest of average everyday Americans every single day. They do so maliciously. They withhold exculpatory evidence. They target people they don't like and things of that sort. How has your time as a defense attorney informed how you see what is currently going on in the national stage as it relates to the prosecutions of, let's say, a few prominent names, General Flynn, President Trump, and let's just start with those two, because like those two are probably enough to deal with content-wise.
It's a great question. And, it's been a journey for me as well. I am still every day a little bit shocked by what I am seeing. I feel like we are on this downward spiral. I feel like the snowball is rolling down the hill and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day. I mean, when I was practicing law, yes, there's and there still is, right? Don't get me wrong. There are massive levels of corruption and you can see it everywhere you turn. Some of it's not as nefarious and intentional as you would see. Some of it's kind of just, negligence, bureaucracy, injustices that happen just because it's too big and burdensome and people don't care anymore and everything's in a spreadsheet now. And so, for my types of clients, it was mostly that. It's a lot of people who just get forgotten about by the system, or people who are prejudged. That's a drug addict, or that's a sex addict, or that's somebody who just is a worthless, human, and we're just going to throw away the key and prosecute people without any real eye towards justice or reform. It's just kind of a mechanical process, and there's a lot of injustice that goes on in that. There's also this, parallel type of cover-up mentality, this good old boys club, this blue shield, this prosecutor's badge that a lot of them will hide behind. And then that's when you start to get into some really big problems. Like what I would see more specifically, and remember, what we're talking about here on this stage is really matters of first impression with Donald Trump, General Flynn, Peter Navarro, all these guys, right? This is a political type of prosecution, a political type of warfare that I don't think has been as open and brazen as we're seeing it right now. So, in my time, we still see it. There was one case in Arizona, one set of cases where, a DUI blood testing machine will become problematic. It will spit out some error. And so the general thesis is you've got to pull the whole machine out, do a root cause analysis on the machine. Why is it erroring out? And then put it back into service. And so like stuff like that happens all the time. It doesn't sound like a big, massive conspiracy, but the prosecutors, the government will cover that up. Okay, so they'll put this machine back in service and they'll say, no, there was no problem. We just turned a knob or something like that. And then there's, hundreds or thousands of more DUIs that go through a bad machine. And then when you call them out on that, right, and look, I can understand people making mistakes and things going wrong and stuff like that. But the problem is when you call them out, then there's this massive cover up that exists, right? Everybody's trying to save their jobs and everybody's trying to protect their institutions and protect their officers and protect their cases, right? They don't want all their cases to be dismissed. So that's just a microcosm. Like that's happening everywhere across the country every day, right? There are and look, there are a lot of good prosecutors and a lot of good police officers, but there are people covering their butts every day all across this country at a small state level, city level. And so to think that that is also not happening on the grand stage with Peter Navarro or with Donald Trump or with all of these other institutions, I think is just disconnected from reality. It is the same thing. It actually, I think it's worse. I think in many situations on the state level, it's covering your butts. It's a little more defensive than it is offensive. And what we're seeing on the national stage is this offensive use of the DOJ to go after people and take them off the board. And, that as a student of the Constitution, as somebody who loves the law, who loves the logic and the mechanics of the law, who thinks that we shouldn't have political prosecutions in America, it's a horrifying thing for me to see. And I think a lot of other lawyers are probably recognizing that. Like we went through the Biden plea deal, the Hunter Biden plea deal last week in depth. And I was reading through that and I was shocked by what I was hearing these lawyers argue in front of a federal judge. It was so below the ethical standards of what, we all swear oaths and take oaths and we try to, at least when I was practicing, right, to do justice, even if it's not exactly in you have to advocate for your client, but you're not doing anything unethical. Okay, you're not crossing those ethical boundaries. Like you got to push, 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 push. But to drop below that line is just it's shocking to me. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I have a lot of instruction from my years practicing, but I think what we're seeing here in many ways is without precedent. And so, I
Absolutely.
think a lot of people are all waking up to this new reality and deciding how to navigate it.
Yeah, the Hunter Biden story is particularly disturbing to me because it kind of reflects a few things. It reflects the perverse, incestuous relationship between the media and law enforcement, and it also kind of shows how that relationship informs what they do. So, for example, as far as I understand it, the Gary Sharpley testimony established that there was active intervention from the DOJ and the IRS's investigation of Hunter Biden. There was active intervention in the IRS having knowledge about the Hunter Biden laptop, which allegedly has multiple pieces of evidence about Hunter Biden's financial crimes on that. And there was like several levels of cover up. And then you consider what was happening in social media. You consider what was happening with the Hunter Biden laptop story. You consider how it was being suppressed. You consider how it was being called disinformation. And you have two levels of cover up that, just don't come from one bad actor or two bad actors, but rather come from a broader systemic effort to control the narrative and ultimately engineer the result of a particular legal case. That is when you get into really, some folks would say, conspiratorial territory, but increasingly we are seeing this is not really conspiratorial. This is actually what's happening. The empirical evidence bears this out, which is why I think a lot of people have been coming towards the light of truth over the past, I don't know, few years. People who would, because like right now on the conservative right, and I consider myself a constitutional conservative, it was a sacred cow. It was uncontested orthodoxy for decades to say that I back the blue. That was
Right.
uncontested orthodoxy.
Right.
That was a sacred hill you had to bind yourself to if you wanted to be a viable conservative voice or candidate or anything in politics that was major. But since Donald Trump, General Flynn, and others, and increasingly things that happened before them, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, who are now becoming heroes on the right, since they became noticed by the public, I Back the Blue is currently receding into the background because people are beginning to realize that law enforcement is not to be deified, it's not to be worshipped. It is to be respected as a profession, but also held accountable because we don't worship them. They are supposed to protect and serve us. And people are increasingly becoming aware of the fact that that's not actually the case. In many cases, of course, in some cases, it is the case. But in a lot of cases, it's increasingly not the case. And in fact, law enforcement, federal law enforcement especially, appears to be the enforcement arm of this deeper administrative state going on. So let's go to the Hunter Biden, unless you have something to say about that. Let's go to the Hunter Biden case really quickly. I don't know, Rob. I'm when I first heard about Hunter Biden a few years ago, I just completely ignored it. I'm like, who cares? Just another gossip TMZ type thing. But
Right.
as I continue to read the story and study it over the past few months, I'm beginning to realize this kind of reflects sort of oligarchy that reigns in our nation, that has special treatment, that can call shots, and unless there's public pushback to what they do, they reign supreme. And a friend of mine kind of gave me this analogy. I want your thoughts on it. He talks about the yacht, and he basically says that there is this very powerful group of people across all industries that kind of know each other. It's kind of like a small exclusive group, and they're all on what we could call a yacht. And there are different levels of the yacht. Some levels are more exclusive than others. And if you're on the yacht, not only do you get special treatment, but you can kind of get away with certain things. And the theory is that Hunter Biden is actually on the yacht, which is why there's been this concerted campaign to secure his public reputation and protect him from criminal penalty over the past few years. And people like Donald Trump and Michael Flynn are not really on the yacht. They've known people on the yacht. They've been adjacent to the yacht. They probably used it in the past, but they're not really on the yacht. What do you think about that theory? It kind of conceptualizes this entire distinction between the powerful and the non-powerful and the treatment they receive.
I like it. I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and it helps to explain some of what we've been seeing. I mean, you take a look at Hunter Biden, and the amount of evidence against the guy is just insurmountable. He's got a laptop. The guys at Marco Polo have put together 600 plus page report on it. And I understand your position on it. I was a little bit the same way too. I have a close connection with, alcoholism, being a recovered alcoholic. I understand addiction. I lost my brother to, drugs and suicide. I get it. And I get, therapy and treatment and all of that. But it's not an excuse to, exploit the country. And it's not an excuse to, do some of the deeds that he did and then just dismiss the whole thing on the back of addiction. And the actions, right? Not the addiction, not the smut, not the, the dirty, gross, disgusting stuff you see on the laptop. That's just a symptom of a much deeper problem, which is really, the relationships, the corruption, the transactions, the exploitation of political power in VP Biden's office. And so when I look at Hunter Biden, I see what you were mentioning before, protection inside the courtroom, protection outside the courtroom. You had the entire CIA, work with Anthony Blinken to draft that 51 so-called intelligence expert letter. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was on Biden's campaign, was working with Mike Morrell to draft that letter. He sent it around to all of the other CIA people. They all signed off on it. So you start asking yourself, why is that? And I could parse it both ways, or it could be both. It could be that they are in, Hunter's back pocket, or Hunter's in their back pocket. Hunter is the bag man for, all of these intelligence agencies. He's perfectly nestled, right in with this Biden family, who's been at the core of American politics for the last 30 plus years. He's just kind of the perfect spoke, or the hub to like this spoke of criminality. And so they're protecting him. He's on the yacht. They're not going to let him off the yacht. They're not going to let anybody else on the yacht. He's got a safe distance away. And so they'll keep protecting him. And, in these situations, from their perspective, I've often been asking myself, how is our Justice Department devolving so rapidly, where we can see in open court these prosecutors telling the judge, we have no precedent for this. We just made it up. This never happened before, ever, right? Just communicating that. Like, what is going on here? And I think it's multiple layers. It's one side is certainly protecting Biden, protecting Hunter as the bag man for the Biden administration. But the other side of that is eliminating Trump, and it's eliminating conservatives and constitutional conservatives, people who are challenging that. And when their institutions are at stake, whether it's a Durham or it's a Comey or any U.S. attorney, right? These people, I think they default towards the DOJ. They've been there for 20, 30 years. They're institutionalists, first and foremost. And the ends justify the means. And so if they're going to violate the Constitution to prosecute their political enemies in Trump, they'll do it. If they're going to violate the standard precedent norms of plea deals and colluding between secretaries of state and CIA to pull the wool over all of our eyes during an election on very important stuff, it's because they think the ends justify the means. They're going to get to the outcome, and the constitutional problems are not worthwhile.
Yeah, no, and actually I have some thoughts on this. So in addition to being interested in politics, I'm also quite interested in philosophy, and also the philosophy of law. I'm kind of a self-educated student of philosophy, continuing to learn. And so as someone who's a practicing lawyer for so many years, maybe you can give me your thoughts on what I'm about to say. I think you say, how can these prosecutors justify this complete and utter abolition of precedent? Well, I think precedent is actually part of the problem. See, if you go far enough back in the case law history of the United States, you would, like, if you go to the first few cases, Marbury versus Madison, what have you, you will see more references towards natural law and philosophy and other broader conceptual ideas, as opposed to common law, which eventually became the formation basis for stare decisis and all that kind of stuff. And I'm moved to think that a court system based on moral principles that has to philosophically justify itself is a sounder system than a court system based on whatever the previous person said. And if that previous person's opinion has been upheld by other previous persons, all of whom could have formed their opinions and their evaluation of that opinion on a very flawed basis, which is why, there's this book by Haley Arks, who's like a legal philosopher, and he calls it near natural law. And he says that originalism, the philosophy of originalism, while it's interesting and it is valuable, it's not enough, because originalism almost always harkens back to original precedent, as opposed to moral and conceptual clarity. I think that we really need to have, and I've been harkening about this for a long time on my channel, a revolution of the mind, where not only everyday Americans, but also people in our legal systems and our political systems don't really care about the orthodoxies and sacred cows of our day. They don't really care about, for example, how a politician is supposed to speak. They don't really care about, for example, stare decisis. They care about what is morally correct. Now, the eminent objection to that is Christian. Everyone has a different idea of morality. This is correct. But guess what? Most people are wrong about their different ideas of morality. There is an objective moral truth. And our founders knew that. The people who framed our legal system knew that. There is an objective moral truth. The people in England, like Blackstone, who really wrote the commentaries in the law and really helped our founders map out our legal system, also worked from the premise that there is an objective truth that can be evaluated in reality through the human faculty of reason. I think that if we got back to that, Robert, we would have a much sounder system, and a lot of the corruption that we see wouldn't be totally weeded out, but we would have a basis to fight it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's some brilliance there. I think that even our founders talked about, natural law and natural rights and this stuff that emanates from the logic of existence, and you can't really drop below that bottom common denominator. I think of it almost like we reach a certain threshold where, free speech and stuff like that becomes important. And once you hit that threshold, in my opinion, there's no possibility of going back below that, right? I mean, that's the base layer. Like, we'll die on that hill. Free speech. It's never happened before in this country or in this world, right? Or what we've had here until the founders invented this written constitution and memorialized it and anchored it in there, almost a codification of those natural rights that you were describing in some way. Now, again, I don't think that is probably the end all be all, that's going to define all of our natural rights. And that's the end of the conversation in any way, shape, or form. But I also agree with you that what we have now is almost like this hoarder country where we've just been hoarding the laws, like you see on the people on the TV shows, where they're just passing new legislation, passing new case law, new precedent. You've got all these different judges. Everybody's got their different opinions, and they're all layering on top of one another. And then what happens is you fast forward from the 1700s in Marbury versus Madison up until Casey versus Planned Parenthood. And we say to ourselves, wait a minute, like, where did this abortion opinion come from with Roe versus Wade and then Casey afterwards? And how do we get here? How do we reason ourselves into this position where the Supreme Court of the United States, unelected people who were, appointed in there, basically crafted legislation in Roe versus Wade, right? Crafted it on their own accord, outside of the purview of the executive, of the legislative branch, just to kind of do things on their own. And then when the current court reverses that, okay, so when they come back and they say, hey, hang on a minute, this case from the mid-1950s is not in comportment with that original base layer natural law that we codified in the Constitution. And when we reverse that to have a return to form, okay, to almost have this restoration of the original principles, then they scream at us for saying, you've destroyed 50 years of precedent, right? And that's where all of this now, you go, well, wait a minute. All your precedent, it's time, we got to purge a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. All of this burdensome law and all of this convoluted nonsense, like the dormant commerce clause or like the commerce clause. Have you ever looked into that stuff? I mean, it's insane what the founders wrote in the commerce clause versus what the courts have interpreted the commerce clause to mean, which means that they can basically regulate anything, anywhere, everywhere, if it is an item that engages in commerce. And we say,
know that. Wow.
Man, if you want to rage about something, read about the Commerce Clause, and you'll see what the courts did to the Commerce Clause. It started out as a very, very, far removed ability to regulate commerce in between the states or amongst the states. And now it's turned into this thing where if you even create a product and put it in a stream of commerce, they can regulate you, tax you, do anything. And that's just one pattern that has existed across all these different, silos of the law. And as you mentioned, right, it turns into this big bureaucratic thing where we're just trying to get back to the base layer truth. We want to know about justice. We want to know about free speech. We want to know about due process and equal protection and all this stuff. But how can you even analyze Hunter Biden's, judicial process without all of these uh, attempts to disturb it or attempts to pervert it, to change the true nature of it, to try to sell us justice when it's not justice, and we can all see it's not justice. And we are now starting to wake up, as you mentioned. People are starting to emerge and say, "There's cocaine in the White House," right?
Yeah.
That is something that everybody can connect to and relate and say, hey, if that was in my office, if that was in my house, maybe they know somebody who got stopped for marijuana or something like that, right? It is a different standard, and people are seeing it. And so I agree with you that this objective truth, people are going to, I think, stop living in this fantasy world where people will tell them everything they want to hear and expect it all to come true. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and I'll mention something else. I was ruminating on something you mentioned. You said the ends justify the means for a lot of these people. Well, that's a particular moral theory. The ends justify the means. That's consequentialism. And in a system where you just have precedent as your guiding star and nothing that really anchors you to the fundamental truth, then those different moral theories that are corrupt can easily creep in and take hold of the institution. So even for practical matters, a lot of folks say, well, Christian, this isn't really practical. Okay, let's say you don't really think it's practical. Practically, we do have a guiding moral philosophy in the justice system right now. We do have a guiding moral philosophy that the deep state has undertaken right now, and it is the ends justify the means. And if you don't replace that, not with just new people, forget the people, with a different moral philosophy, then the system will still become tyrannical. It will just move into different hands. And I think about, because I like to go back to the origins of things. I think about the origins of the administrative state during the Progressive Era. In 1887, Woodrow Wilson writes this essay that a lot of folks don't really know about called The Study of Administration. And in this essay, Wilson plainly claims that the constitutional question that has been debated for decades and a long time is no longer interesting for us. We need to focus on how government is ran. Forget the constitutional question. We need to focus on administration. And that's when they began importing ideas from Europe, particularly from Germany, from Otto von Bismarck's regime, and the progressive thinkers of that time began enshrining centralization, enshrining the accumulation of power in the hands of a few people into our system. And that's when you see the spawning of so many of these different departments that currently characterize the executive branch, and then the consequent emergence of the regulatory regime, which has really burdened a lot of Americans in many different sectors of life. It's from that one philosophy that morality is no longer important. Doing is important. But how do you inform your actions? How can you do anything without a guiding philosophy? You can't. But this is kind of the perversion progressivism has wrought upon America. And so we have to reverse it. I don't know how we can do that other than by modeling counterexamples, but we have to reverse it. We have to do something to go against it. Because as I see it, this is the same mentality that a lot of people are using to defend the continued existence of the FBI. Because right now, there's presidential candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy that are speaking about abolishing the FBI. And a lot of folks are like, you can't do that. Why would you do that? And there's no real argumentation there. It's all just really appeal to tradition, appeal to precedent. And I'm thinking to myself, this is an organization which has basically committed some of the greatest acts of domestic terrorism in the history of our country. A lot of folks don't realize that Robert Mueller, who used to be director of the FBI, back in the early 2000s, after 9/11, Robert Mueller was pressured by other members of the administrative state, including in his own agency, to claim that the anthrax attacks actually came from Iraq because they were trying to find a reason to justify the Iraq war. So they pressured him to say that. And then, of course, John McCain and others go out on the TV and say, hey, the anthrax attacks came from Iraq. The whole manufacturing of consent. That's probably the least egregious thing the FBI have tried to do. And of course, you probably know all of this, but a lot of folks seem to think this just came out in the past 4 years. No. COINTELPRO, all these different programs. Can you kind of walk us through that? Because the FBI has a very corrupt history that a lot of folks seem oblivious about, but it kind of informs us of what's going on right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on FBI history, but I do know it goes
Yeah.
back to J. Edgar Hoover, and I mean, there's all sorts of wiretapping on, the FBI was infiltrating sitting senators, congresspeople, arguably, the president at some point, having tapped phone calls and all sorts of bizarre stuff. There were arguments that J. Edgar Hoover was the most powerful man in the country because of all the dirt that he had on literally everybody else. And so once you have an agency like that that just gains critical mass and can gobble up more power and more leverage over Congress, then who's really in charge? And the way that I can see this, I think most obviously, is just today, is just watching how the FBI interacts with the rest of the country. I mean, they scoff at and laugh at Congress people. They are in there, almost as though there is no oversight. There is no accountability that's going to come down upon them, and they almost know it. And it's the brazenness with which they operate. So, this year I think they're asking for $1 billion new headquarters, and they don't tell us anything about the truth about, some of the most consequential things in this country, like January 6th. Don't we have a right to see more of the surveillance footage? Don't we have a right to know how many confidential human sources were embedded in there? We covered the Proud Boys trial. There were, according to the defense attorneys on the Proud Boys trial, at least 50 that they identified, sources, confidential human sources or other people involved on January 6th that they were able to identify just amongst the 5 Proud Boy defendants. 50. So 10 to 1 is what the defense identified. I'm sorry, whatever that is, right? 50 to 1, 50 to 5. So whatever, you do the math, 5 to 1. So it's that, but then there was a whole nother agency there that was called Homeland Security Investigations that had their dozens of CHSs and other informants. Who knows what actually went on there? But the government, the U.S. prosecutors, even in the J6 Proud Boys trial transcripts, they confirmed that they had identified, the government stipulated that there were 8 CHSs in the Proud Boys trial. So 8 CHSs, 5 defendants, and the FBI was picking up Enrique Tarrio from jail, which was the leader of the Proud Boys, the day before January 6th, or on January 4th. They picked him up and they, basically plugged him back in. So not only are they, there, I think, instigating it, they are causing a lot of this stuff to happen. And there were a couple co-defendants in the Governor Whitmer plot, which was that kidnapping plot out of Michigan, who got not guilty verdicts on that one. And, if you read those text messages, the FBI is telling these people the plot is to eliminate the governor. Exactly. Like, say that's the plot. Okay, we're going to go take out the governor, like, right now. And they're funding money. They're, dumping hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars into these various organizations to create these things and set them up. And then when Congress says, we want to know about how much money you're spending on this, or we want you to show up here and answer questions, Christopher Wray's like, I got a plane to catch, bro. Like, I'm out of here, and leaves before the whole hearing's over. So when you have that type of corruption, I'm not sure what you can do about that entity or about that institution, which is why guys like, Vivek and others who were saying, you got to just get rid of them and return it back to actual law enforcement that hasn't been weaponized to really maintain the status quo, right? I think it's a lot about the status quo. You get a guy like Trump who comes in here and deviates the course, and then they freak out. We saw what happened 2020. They locked the house down after he got in 2016.
Yeah, the FBI needs to be abolished, and there needs to be several prosecutions. People need to go to jail. I think there's a strong case for James Comey to go to jail. James Comey, he was literally leaking secrets about the Russia investigation case to his contacts in the media when he knew that the entire thing was just concocted and manufactured. And then you had Andrew McCabe, who was doing the same kind of thing, gets fired for it, and then becomes a CNN commentator on the issue he got fired for. Yeah, there needs to be people need to go to jail. People need to go to jail, in my opinion.
Right, and James Baker. So James Baker from the FBI was there in 2016 when Michael Sussman, James Baker is this big name. Michael Sussman was the guy who was facilitating the Christopher Steele PP tape hoax all during 2016. Sussman went and Sussman was a lawyer, went to the FBI. James Baker was general counsel for the FBI. They did the whole 2016 PP tape collusion thing. Michael Sussman was prosecuted for that. Absolutely should have been, but he was acquitted because this was all taking place in DC, and the juries just said we got bigger fish to fry than trying to go get anti-Trump hoaxers. And so James Baker lived at the FBI for a long time until it got too hot from him. We had the McCabe, the Sussman, all that whole trial went down. Baker then left the FBI, went over to Twitter, where he was doing general counsel work at Twitter. Elon bought the place, and Baker was an inside mole over there doing Lord knows what, because they were facilitating with Twitter this entire time to censor people back during the election. So like the amount of collusion and this little assembly line like they have, where you just go, you put your time in the government, you do your due diligence, you're a good warrior, a good soldier, then we'll leave you out. You'll go into the private sector. We'll send you into a private law firm, go to Twitter, go to Google, go work at these, big law firms, be making tons of money. And it's just this little system, and it just protects this. They all go to the same country clubs. They all go to the same cocktail parties, and they have interests that are aligned, and they're not America's interests.
Yeah, no, there's a comment that just came through, by the way, before we get back to the general topics. I want to kind of get your thoughts on, Robert.
Sure.
From Crash to the Contrary, it says, given Rob's position, which we en masse agree with, who actually believes that we will be a country after Biden wins 2024? Not me and my divorce. Well, I have a few thoughts to offer before Robert comes in. So I don't presume that Biden will win legitimately. That's all I'll say on that one. I don't presume that he will win.
Yeah.
I don't know if he will, but I doubt it. If he does, it's not going to be legitimately. That's number one. Number two, even if he does win, America has endured, and I know this will not be a popular position, we've endured worse presidents. Woodrow Wilson was a worse president. LBJ was worse than LBJ, and we'll get into this in a bit if you want to, Robert, is the one who kind of initiated the civil rights era of lawfare that groups like the NAACP and the SPLC have been using for decades to control American life through overregulation and through the establishment of precedents based on false legal theories. So we're still seeing LBJ's ghost affect our country today in the worst way possible. Biden couldn't dream to have that much influence, I think. But also this broader point about national divorce. America is a unique experiment based on a philosophy that was updated from Catholic foundations, from Aquinas, and inspired by a bunch of different intellectual groups like the Stoics, and brought into the Enlightenment that really no other country is based upon. So you shouldn't necessarily expect there to be tensions, there to be divisions. For a country to say all men are created equal, regardless of your ethnicity, your class status, if you are a human being, you are by virtue of that equal. And then to go on and say that we're going to create a society where that is an ethic, you're going to have a lot of different people coming in that may believe very different things. And so the goal of a society like that is to try to mediate tensions, to try to reconcile goals, while also ensuring the overarching principles of that nation remain intact. But if more conservatives and more people on the right, people who are just enlightened, lose faith in that project, then I think our great experiment would have been for nothing. So I don't think we should lose faith. People should be inspired. The fact that we have people like Robert, and people like me trying to do things in this space, people should be inspired. They should be empowered, and they should go ahead and confront this beast by the horns. We've got dragons to slay. But if our knights are cowardly and they're hiding behind their armor as opposed to using it in battle, those dragons will consume us. Well, those are my thoughts. What about yours?
Brilliant thoughts. I actually am also optimistic about it. I think that the country is certainly going to go through a period of trials and tribulations, and I think that there is a lot of evidence to support that. A couple things that stand out in my mind. There's a book called The Fourth Turning, talks about the cycles of society, 4 different stages. And he says we're in the 4th stage, we're in the 4th turning of this, and that there's always trials and tribulations that happen. And it's kind of a natural cycle of society. So we just have to, batten down the hatches and recognize we're going through this. And awareness is kind of the first step. And then we'll survive and we'll come out through it on the other end. And there's a lot of other theses like that. There's this book called Pendulum that talks about it. Ray Dalio talks about the rise and falls of empires. And if you haven't seen his Principles for a Changing World Order, he's got a 45-minute video out there that's incredible, that talks about this and about, one empire falling and another empire rising. And in his prognostication, America's falling due to the debt and due to the collapse of our currency, and other countries will rise in comparison to that. And so there's a lot out there that is certainly doomer-ish. And I do believe that we are going through an era, an epoch right now. There's no question about it. But I sort of, to go back to our prior topic, this idea that, in this country, we have reached a critical threshold. I think that there is a beautiful thing in all of the incredible American patriots and, immigrants that we have here, everybody who is on the side of liberty and freedom. I think that is really, and I know it sounds kind of, maybe fluffy or just like rhetoric, but I think that there is really a critical mass of people here that have aligned themselves with freedom. And that when this totalitarian system continues to march forward, there will be a reaction to that. And that reaction will actually lead to more freedom, not less. It may not be more freedom for everybody, but it will not be less for the people who reach that critical mass. And there's this idea, Sandra Day O'Connor talked about the laboratories of democracy, and about, this idea that we've got these different states, and the states still have a lot of autonomy relative to the federal system. And so that people can pick up and move and go to these different places. And you've got states like Texas that are already talking about, making Bitcoin this preserving your right to mine and possess Bitcoin. And you've got these parallel competing systems that are bubbling up, and they're going to continue to bubble up over this next course of our lives. And so it's important that we're aware and cognizant of that, so that we can reallocate our money in terms of what currencies are valuable. We can reallocate our location, pick up and move locations, right? Create the communities we want to live in, so that we create that social fabric that almost you were talking about. I think Edmund Burke talks about that, and John Locke and these guys. How do we weave together this social fabric that is very strong, that's dynamic? We're not all the same threads. We're not all the same cultures. We're not all the same, religion, ethnicity, backgrounds, but we want to weave this social fabric together. And we're seeing that being ripped apart, stripped apart. We can't even agree on pronouns. We can't agree on economics if we can't agree on pronouns. So while the country might feel like a divorce, arguably COVID felt like a divorce to me. I mean, there's a big swath of people in this country that I know now are 100% opposed to my worldview, 100%, right? Because of what they mandated and what they ordered the rest of the world to comply with. So I think we're seeing these self-sorting, we're seeing these divisions emerge, and I don't know that it's in the form of two United Stateses, or the United States and the state of Texas and the state of California, but I do think that there will be bigger divisions there, and that the states are going to start fighting back. Texas is going to flex. Missouri's flexing against the ATF. You're seeing, Texas is now flexing on the border. So the government, as its capacity to deliver continues to fail. In San Francisco, right? They say, we're going to equity and we're going to give everybody everything they want. It's going to be the most beautiful utopia in the world. They can't deliver. Their promises will fail. People will be waiting here for those promises to be delivered, and they're going to fail, and it's going to take time. But, I think as long as we keep having the conversation, and Tucker Carlson said something like this, he said, as long as you can hear my voice, there is freedom, or there is hope, right? As long as we can keep having these conversations, then I'm ultimately optimistic. I think that as our jailers lose capacity, we become more free.
Yeah, you said a lot of profound stuff there, but there was one thing that really struck a chord with me. You just said, if we can't agree on pronouns, we can't agree on economics. That is really, really profound. No, it's profound because economics, people think of pie charts and coarse grain graphs when they think about economics. No. Economics in its base form is the science of human interaction. It's the only valid form of sociology. All the other crap that they put in universities about sociology is Marxist influenced nonsense. Economics is the only valid form of sociology because it looks at man. It looks at man as an individual, then proceeds to look at his interests and what he values, and then proceeds to look at how he uses individuality and his interests to pursue transactions in society and therefore build things. It is literally the science of human interaction. But if you can't agree on someone's basic condition, if they're a male or a female, how can you really understand what they want, what they value, and who they are? You begin with a subjective premise, you will ultimately reach a subjective conclusion. So, no, I think that's, and a lot of people just think the pronoun stuff is silly. No, it's actually quite pernicious. It's really, it's really dangerous, because you have to have a baseline understanding of certain ideas in order to behave in a morally responsible way. And people don't realize that. You have to be rational to be a human being, because human beings are the only creatures on this earth that are endowed with reason. And so people just take that for granted. Say, oh, if they want to call me pronouns or whatever, they can just do whatever they want. And of course, I'm someone who believes in freedom. If someone wants to have male pronouns and they're a female or whatever, you go ahead. But to make that a societal mandate is to overthrow reason and replace it with subjective expression, and then therefore threaten the whole of society by threatening our ability to understand the world for what it is. So,
and they castigate you if you don't comply with that. If you don't comport with that new modality, you're now a bigot, you're a racist, you're somebody who doesn't believe in equity, you should be fired, you should be lambasted on social media. And it's not just about the freedom to live the way that somebody wants to live. Certainly I agree with you on that. Pronoun it up, have go hog wild about it.
Absolutely.
But when we then are forced and compelled to use certain speech and to then change the whole system, the structure of the schools, everything, right, is now, you can't talk about it unless it's in our frame. And that's as bad as anything, because that's an outright attack on your ability to speak. And as you said, to actualize yourself as a human.
Absolutely. So let's move over to Lawfare, because I see all of this. Are we good on time, by the way? Are we good on time?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's move over to Lawfare, because I think that, we see the collaboration of the deep state with the media as a very big threat to freedom. It's probably the most pressing threat to freedom. But Lawfare is probably the second most pressing threat to freedom as it relates to the legal system. So there's this theory, I would like your opinion on it, if you're familiar, that impact litigation and these different sort of modes of trying to change the society by legislating through the courts began through the civil rights era legislation, where protected classes were established and so many other things were established. And a lot of folks don't want to really evaluate this, because they assume that the civil rights movement and the legislation that followed is inherently benevolent, because they were contesting some very prescient evils. Because it's true, they were contesting prescient evils. Jim Crow was a prescient evil, most certainly. And I don't think, and no one with a moral conscience can really deny that. But sometimes when we're fighting evil, we can take upon the image of a different evil and then justify that under the veil of defeating the current evil. And that's really one of the things that a lot of people take for granted. And so, from my understanding, what happened during the civil rights era is that protected classes became a thing, which then also led to a bunch of unconstitutional assumptions. For example, I forgot what the case is called. You probably know better than me. The Gorsuch case a few years ago, where Gorsuch literally said that sexuality and gender identity are in the Civil Rights Act 1964, but in all reality, not. He basically, when I was kind of disappointed, because Gorsuch was supposed to be a constitutionalist, he's a smart man, but he basically read those things into a law when letter law didn't say that, and he did it and he was able to do it because protected classes exist. So how much damage do you think, if at all, the civil rights phenomenon did to our legal system? And what are some of the more egregious examples of lawfare that you've seen in the past few years that have concerned you?
Well, so, Civil Rights Act is a complicated one, because like anything in the law, it gets passed and then it gets exploited. And what you've talked about is this constant reading of additional rights into the law where they don't exist. And we've seen this time and time again in the Supreme Court. Conservatives do it, liberals do it. And I think part of the reason this happens is because the court has to protect its legitimacy. if the court is deemed to be illegitimate, they don't have a lot of enforcement mechanisms that the other branches of government have. The executive branch has the power to enforce the law through the FBI, through the Justice Department. Congress has the power of the purse. The courts really have legitimacy, right? They've got judicial review, which was established by Marbury versus Madison, and then they can now say what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. And so there's always this balance that the court, in my experience, has been playing as society evolves. In other words, they're trying to balance the popular sentiment. So, Civil Rights Act, right? It's a popular thing back then, and it's going to solve some immediate needs for society and fix some things that everybody really wants right there. So the court is not at that moment then going to turn around and say unconstitutional. I think a more recent example of this would be Obamacare. Obamacare was this bizarre opinion that came out. This is a good example of this because this was the court, in my opinion, trying to protect its legitimacy over the Constitution, okay, over moral right outcomes, over anything else, like legitimacy first and foremost. And when you frame it that way, I think some of their decisions make more sense, why the court does certain things and why they will tuck certain rights up into other rights. But in the Obamacare case, I believe that was a 5-4 decision, and Judge Roberts sided with the liberals. And he sided with the liberals because he recategorized this law as a tax. And he just kind of made it up. He's like, well, the government has the power to tax people. It's a huge, broad power. And so this is kind of relative to a tax. So I'm just going to fit it in here. And, guys like me were outraged. I mean, I was inspired by John Roberts when I watched him testify in front of the Senate committees. I was like, man, this guy is so on point. It's crazy. And then to see him twist himself into a pretzel a little bit to try to get this thing passed, I thought was shocking. And it was a big wake-up call for me because I realized that it is about the legitimacy. He was the Chief Justice, and he's trying to just protect the court. And we have this new, young, super popular president who had just come in, Barack Obama. The whole country was like at his back, and he could basically do nothing wrong at this moment, right? They passed Obamacare. It was this big, resounding victory. And so the courts jumped onto it, right? The courts just said, oh, no problem with that. And so we see that, even though it might be, I have a hard time believing that John Roberts, like, legally feels good about that opinion, truthfully, like in his heart, but he had to do it in order to save the legitimacy of the court, because if he would have called Obamacare unconstitutional, they probably would have done something. There was so much power at the back of that White House and Congress at the time that they might have been able to change the whole power of the court in a major way. So, like, as much as we want them to be not political, they're political, and they're protecting the institution in a way that they think is in the best interest of the longevity of the court. So when you see, like, Gorsuch, tucking in these other rights back into the Civil Rights Act, it's almost back to that prior conversation we had about hoarding. It's just, well, we'll just add it in there. Put that on my tab. Put that on my tab. Put that on my tab. And then eventually these laws turn into these big, bloated, unrecognizable things where, now we've got, I don't know how far this the civil rights law will be extended, but it does create a whole new, bag of legal opportunity for people to latch onto or to exploit for their own ends. And we ask ourselves, is that what the point of this was in the first place? Is that
right?
Is that where this should be?
Yeah, so I see there are two divisions in lawfare. There's lawfare by independent. I use that in scare quotes because they're not always independent. Independent actors, the NAACP, SPLC, which we know collaborate with law enforcement all the time. They're not really independent, but they're independent seeming actors. And then there is lawfare by the deep state, by the FBI, by the DOJ, against their political opponents. So I think this kind of is a good segue. Before we get into the segue, there's a question here that I found very interesting from Bob Littlefish. It says, Robert, do you ever worry that the men in black might be threatening SCOTUS's kids? And he follows up by saying, I have seen evidence of men in black threatening Congress. Why would they not do it to the court? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I would imagine that they're not immune. I mean, why would the judges be immune from that? I think, Senator Schumer had that one quote when he was talking about Trump, where he said, you don't want to screw the FBI. Don't want to get on the wrong side. They'll screw you 6 ways from Sunday or something like that. And and that's the Senate. That's like the lead senator of the Democrats, like, the top guy there. So if he's, that nervous about even digging on the FBI, I got to imagine that the same levers of power also apply to the judges. And it honestly, it makes me like sick to think that way, because I cherish this institution, and it is such an important structure that we have. And so the idea that it is being exploited extra constitutionally by these bureaucrats in power, it just makes my blood boil. But I can't imagine that it's not happening.
Yeah, mine too as well. Mine too. So, speaking of lawfare against the current president, so you did a great video, several videos actually, but a great one on the Alvin Bragg prosecution when
Yes.
when the indictment first came out. You did, I think, one of the best videos on that. I mean, now we see that Trump's probably going to get indicted in another jurisdiction as well very soon. So just walk us through the current cases against the president, former president rather, and kind of talk about their implications and how they are an example of like lawfare and the abuse of our system.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. I'll give you the rundown. So I expect Trump to have 4 open felony criminal cases. Currently, we have 2 of them. We have the first one that you mentioned, which was the one out of New York City that was brought by Alvin Bragg. That is such a ridiculous case. It involves payments, basically transactions, 34 felony counts, if I'm not mistaken. But it's basically, if you read the indictment, it's basically Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, sends Donald Trump a bill for legal services. That's one felony. The invoice, getting the invoice, is one felony. Then Trump puts that invoice into his bookkeeping software, felony 2. Then Trump cuts a check for the invoice, felony 3. Now, those 3 felonies, it's like a monthly subscription program. Every month for a full year gives you about 34 felonies. I think one month he paid twice or something like that. So it's like that, right? It's these transactions, it's these business records that they have just assembled. They say that Trump made those payments in an illegal fashion when, as far as we can tell, they're just payments to a lawyer. And they're saying that is illegal, right? So 34 felonies. Trump had tried to remove that to federal court, to try to take that out of the state courts and take that to the federal system. That has been rejected. And so that's the status of that case. Is right now we're scheduled for trial on it, but Alvin Bragg has said that he is very likely going to let that case go, or he'll delay that case in favor of a federal case going first. So when you have when a defendant is charged with multiple criminal cases, you have to set up timing. Like, all the trials can't go at the same time. Somebody's got to go first. So Alvin Bragg has apparently communicated that he's going to allow the DOJ to go first. So that's the first one that dropped. The second indictment that dropped was out of Florida. This is the classified documents case. Jack Smith, special counsel. This is a federal level case. So this is dramatically more serious, in my opinion, than the New York case, which was just a state level case. Of course, those are felonies too, but this is it's a little bit of a different ball game. I don't know that a state court judge is going to be as harsh as a federal court judge would be on Trump. So New York, we've got Florida, classified documents. You and I'm sure your audience has seen the photos flying around of the boxes at Mar-a-Lago and all of that stuff. That's the second set of charges. And there was actually a new indictment. It's called a superseding indictment that just dropped on last week. I forget what day it was last week. But so Trump has, I forget the total number of charges on that one, but quite a lot, over 30. And those are for being in possession or willful retention of classified documents. So I think 1 to 34, counts 1 to 34 are the various documents. So one charge, one document, one charge for 34 of those. And they say that they found those on his Mar-a-Lago property. They said that they issued a valid subpoena for those things, and that he didn't return those, and that they're not his documents, and he didn't declassify them, and all of those things. So there's 2 co-defendants on that case. Walt Nauta, which is Trump's valet and kind of right-hand assistant. And then there's another guy called De Oliveira, who is the maintenance guy, kind of a worker down there, right? Who just kind of a property manager is the title. So those charges are coming forward. That trial is scheduled for May of 2024, right before the election. So we're going to have Iowa, I think, goes in January. Then we'll have like New Hampshire, Nevada, and a couple other states. I think South Carolina even all go before May. So then May would come, which is when the federal trial would be in the classified documents case. Now, I'm not sure that that actually goes on that day. I think that there might be another continuance to postpone it until after the November election. But as it's set, it's scheduled for now. So like Trump is scheduled for a jury trial in May of 2024. And if that goes, he could be convicted of felonies before the election on that trial date. So that's number 2. Number 3 is probably going to be coming this week. This is the big one on January 6th. This is special counsel Jack Smith's been investigating everybody. This is taking place out of the DC circuit, and he has breached Trump's attorney-client privilege with his lawyers. So lawyers are testifying in this case. He's breached executive privilege. These DC judges have allowed all this to happen. Breached executive privilege. So Mike Pence testified, Rudy Giuliani testified, Trump's lawyer Evan Corcoran all testified, and Trump got the target letter. So we know they're presenting all of this stuff to a grand jury, and I'm guessing it's going to drop any minute now. And that's going to be the most serious of all of these. And I'm actually concerned about that, and we can get into that, if you want. But there's a lot going on that case, and we don't know what those charges are going to be, but they might be, they might try to hit him with an insurrection charge or even a seditious conspiracy charge, which is the same charge that the Proud Boys got. And it's the same charge that the Oath Keepers got. And the leader of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, got convicted of seditious conspiracy. And by the way, they all pointed their fingers at Trump. Okay. All the defendants pointed their fingers towards Trump and said that, he told them to go do this stuff. He's going to prison for 18 years. And the government is upset about that. They are appealing that 18-year sentence. They want more. For Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, who wasn't even there on January 6th. So my point is, if they hit Trump with that same charge, I mean, if those guys are going away for 2 decades for seditious conspiracy, they think Trump was the most seditious conspirator. He led the whole thing. So and also these guys were in custody this entire time pending their trial ever since January 6th. So if they are too dangerous to let out of custody and to release, why is Trump not also too dangerous to be let out of custody? I think a judge might find the same. Well, Stuart Rhodes is too dangerous. Why isn't Donald Trump too dangerous? Or why Stuart Rhodes gets 18 years. Why shouldn't Donald Trump get 25? And this is all taking place out of DC. And so it's going to be a very, very precarious position. I'm not sure what it's going to look like when the indictment comes. It would be insane if they held him in custody, but we have insane judges in DC. So I don't know. And that's going to be any minute now. I mean, I thought it was going to drop on Friday, but it might drop early this week. And then number 4, I know I'm going on and on and on, but number 4,
please do.
Number 4 is going to be Fani Willis. And so Fani Willis is in Georgia, and she's the DA. She's been investigating this for a long time. So she's got a RICO investigation that's taking place in Georgia. And there was some battle about who was going to go first between her and the J6 prosecution by the special counsel. So we think he's going to go first. And then she's announced that August, right? Early August, like first, second week of August, she's going to drop her RICO charges or her charges. And then that one also might be extensive. So it might involve Rudy Giuliani. It might involve Lindsey Graham. And the crux of that, if you remember during the 2020 election, there was that phone call. Apparently Donald Trump called Brad Raffensperger and said, hey, find 11,000 votes, that call. So that's the election interference, that's the obstruction, that's the conspiracy, all of that in those phone calls. And so that's 4 of them. I think they're all going to drop. 2 of them have already dropped. I think the other 2 are going to drop because this is their campaign. This is their lawfare, as you said.
Jesus. Wow.
It's a lot. I know it's a lot.
It definitely is. And so you said you're concerned about the last case. Do you think that they could actually get a conviction or at least stop him from being able to travel around, do campaign events, all that kind of stuff?
I'm most concerned about the January 6th case. I think that that is a very unfavorable jurisdiction for him to be in the DC Circuit Court. We've covered a lot of other trials in the DC Circuit, mostly the January 6th cases, and the judges there have just a raw antipathy towards January 6th and towards Trump in general. So
Yeah.
when somebody's charged with a crime, they go through an arraignment and the judge sets release conditions. And it's a very critical part of this whole thing. We've seen Trump go through it twice. We saw him go and get arraigned in Florida, released. Same thing in New York with no conditions. So he's got no pretrial services. He doesn't have to wear an ankle monitor. He doesn't have to be on home detention. He's not giving up his passport or anything like that. Whereas a DC judge might do something like that. I don't know, because they have kept, well over 100 J6ers, many of whom were nonviolent. Okay. Enrique Tarrio was not even there. Stuart Rhodes was not even there. They were just planners, and they held him in custody because they were too dangerous. And I know it sounds crazy to think that a DC judge would keep Trump in custody. I know. But if we rewind the clock a year ago, it also sounded crazy that they were going to be indicting him and raiding his home in Mar-a-Lago, So
Yes.
They're at a stage now where I think it's kind of break glass in case of emergency. They don't have a lot of other options. They've got, this demented president who can't even remember where he is most of the time. They've got this corrupt son and this family cover-up that's been exploiting, America for so long.
Yes.
What are they going to do other than prosecute him? And they're on it.
Yeah. So classification, because there's a few questions in the chat I think are pretty good. I'll get to them in a second. Classification. So I have heard from a lot of people. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with Judge Joe Brown.
Yeah.
So he was on the show about a year or so ago, I think, and he said to me, because he has no political really affiliations. He's philosophically a conservative, but he is just a straight shooter. He said to me that Department of Navy versus Egan basically is one of many cases in the Supreme Court's case law that says the president has the exclusive right to determine classification. And here's the very weird thing. If you take the Constitution seriously, the president, being the head of the executive branch, has dominion over everything that is a result of the executive branch, including classified documents. And everything, even a process to declassify, serves at his leisure. So as far as I understand, you let me know if I'm correct here, my little amateur opinion here. The president can simply breathe and declassify a document. He can just breathe and do that. I mean, there is no, the process serves at his behest. So I'm trying to understand, given the fact that there was established case law on this, as a Presidential Records Act, all this kind of stuff, how are they actually going forward with this? Are they just throwing all that out?
Yeah, they're not considering it at all. They say that the congressional statutes apply to him, that Congress passed these rules and that they apply to the president. And I think that's nakedly unconstitutional. Congress can't do that, right? The president, unless they do it by an amendment, when the president has root power in this domain as codified in the Constitution, Congress cannot by a statute supplant that root power. And that's what they've tried to do here with this, with all of the criminal charges. Those are all criminal statutes, including the Presidential Records Act, all of the declassification rules. Okay, those are acts of Congress. And I want to go even one step further than Navy versus Egan. If you go back to the Constitution and you look in Article 2, and you can go in there and you can see there's one section where it talks about the opinions of the president. And I think it's in Article 2, Section 1. It's tucked, the opinion clause is tucked right in between the pardon power. The sentence before it is pardon, and the sentence after it is commander in chief, right? Pardon power, we already know. It resides exclusively with the president. There's no doubt about it. The commander in chief clause, same thing. Now, the opinion clause in the Constitution, and I encourage everybody to go look this up. I'm going to put together, a much bigger project around this. But the opinion clause is not contested a whole lot in the American jurisprudence because it's just not come up. But if you read it, it says the president, right? The commander, the person, not the office of the presidency, not anybody else other than the person, has the right to request the opinion from the directors or from the executives of each of his departments, right? It's in there in one sentence. And in my reading of that, especially in context, because the commander-in-chief power and the pardon power are exclusively his or hers, it's also exclusively the opinion power. And that means that and he says, it says in there in the Constitution, can request the opinion in writing. It's even in the Constitution. Okay. Which means, yes, Trump is the root source of all of that. If Congress were to make the National Archives, Deborah Stidel Wall, the archivist document librarian, more powerful than Trump, then she would be the most, that power would be hers. It's not hers. In the Constitution, it is Trump's. And the Constitution beats any statute. So any criminal statute about willful retention of defense information, anything about obstruction for a fake crime that doesn't even exist, because the power in the Constitution gives the president total unfettered access and possessive ownership of those documents. And I'm hopeful that Trump and his defense team raise that up, because I think it's going to be a matter of first impression. In other words, I don't think you can charge the president. It's like dividing by zero. You can't charge him for something that he is ultimately entitled to. And on your second point about this declassification, I completely agree with that. In the law, we have this thing called constructive possession, which means that you don't necessarily like have the item in your possession, but you kind of have control over it. You know, you have dominion or control over it because you've got leverage over the person who has it, or you've got control over it in some way, shape, or form. So like the law recognizes instances where you don't need necessarily like an overt act to do something. Sometimes things just, we say that is your status because of the status. Trump, just by virtue of moving it, right? Just by moving it out of the White House, that act alone is, he's saying, those are my documents. They're mine. They were in the White House. I'm now taking them with me to my Mar-a-Lago residence. That, saying it declassified it is one thing, but I think they're his documents. So he can do what he wants with those documents. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting arguments around this, but to your base question, they're not bringing that up. They're charging him like a regular criminal. They're just saying and anybody else who's not the president wouldn't have that defense, by the way. Right. So it's only exclusive to him. Yep. And they're just dismissing that, charging him as though it's you or I who had boxes of classified documents.
Right. So it's a revolt against the proper authority of the executive, basically, in the name of congressional supremacy.
Right.
Legislative supremacy, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. And they're also usurping the executive branch almost against itself. Okay. So Congress is saying that the National Archives has more authority and power than the president. So, the National Archives requested the documents back from Trump. Trump didn't give the documents back. Deborah said they're mine. She's the National Archivist. She told the Biden administration. They told the DOJ. The DOJ went and go and get it. And it's only because it's Trump. I mean, if this were any other person, obviously that would not be happening.
So Shrapnel asked this question. He said, "Can you explain the crime immunity in the Hunter Biden plea deal?"
Sure. Yeah, it's a complicated, convoluted explanation, and the judge agrees with this, which is why she beat them up for about 2.5 hours in court over it. But long story short, Hunter's got 3 charges that he's being prosecuted with right now. 2 of them are tax charge misdemeanors. One of them is a felony gun charge. Felony is obviously more serious. The felony gun charge is going to be part of what's called a diversion agreement. And a diversion agreement is a very common thing. This happens all the time. I put hundreds, if not thousands, of clients through diversions. Diversions are usually for first-time offenders, people who have got no other history of, problems, crimes, addiction, any other things. And it's like a, your first, you get a get out of jail free card for your first offense. And so that's what they gave to Hunter. Now, you can have your argument about whether that's appropriate or not, whether, I'm not a big fan of gun charges in general, but I think that they gave him a gun charge to distract from other more serious charges, right? It's a base layer, super minor charge. They could have gotten him with many things worse, but it's just a throwaway. And they charged him with that so that they could shove it into this diversion deal. And typically what a diversion deal is it's an agreement between the defense and the government. If the defendant does a certain thing, does some things, the charge ultimately gets dismissed. So let's say you get charged with a domestic violence offense. you and your significant other are yelling at each other. Somebody calls the cops. It's disorderly conduct. Nobody's hurt. Okay, you two go to anger management classes. We're not going to give you a criminal conviction. Make up, get back to your normal life, right? Okay, sounds good. That's good. That's a good solution. We want more of that, not a bunch of, domestic violent people. So Hunter gets a deal like that. My opinion, totally inappropriate. Should have never been given to him, but they gave it to him. And what they've done is they've created two deals. One deal for the felony gun charge, one deal for the misdemeanor tax crimes. And they've layered these things up in a very, very convoluted way to hide the immunity from the judge. Okay. Long foundation there. Hunter has this diversion plea deal. Because it's a contract between the defense and the government in this case was saying the judge has no authority to look at it. So it's just a private contract. We're just going to agree with Hunter. We're not going to charge him, but he has to plead guilty on these other misdemeanors. And in that misdemeanor plea deal referenced this diversion agreement, which the judge was not seeing. And the diversion agreement, which the judge was not seeing, also included a provision in there that said that the judge would be the arbiter of any diversion problems. So while Hunter is supposed to be out there not breaking the law, not doing drugs, not getting in trouble again, if he breaches that, normally what the DOJ does is they convict you of that underlying diversion charge, and they'll charge you with a new charge for the new crime, right? Because that's their role. They are the executive branch. They prosecute crimes. What they basically were ordering the judge to do is say that if there were a problem in the diversion deal, the judge would adjudicate that problem. In other words, bring it back into her courtroom to circumvent the Department of Justice so that there wasn't another set of charges if Hunter had failed. And in that diversion deal, they also reference in the plea deal a statement of facts in the plea deal. And they say that Hunter is immune from anything in the statement of facts. And that statement of facts is about as broad as you can get. It's like, Hunter had a lot of problem with drugs, and he also worked for some foreign companies. So if there are any drug problems or any foreign company problems or any FARA Foreign Agent Registration Act problems or any other like actual serious tax crimes like structuring LLCs and maliciously, fraudulently trying to defraud the IRS, they charged Hunter with just like he was late paying his taxes, right? Very benign misdemeanors. But when the judge was reading through these two agreements, Hunter's lawyer said, you can't see this one. You can't see anything that's in here. And you can't reject this one because we're filing it under this provision, subsection B. And so the judge took a look at all of this. I know it sounds convoluted. I know that what I described was a very convoluted mishmash. It's exactly what it was. All right. It was so nuts that it looked like they were layering the immunity deal in multiple layers deep. And these attorneys tried to come in here and squeeze it through this judge. And she just started asking simple questions and the whole thing became exposed. Well, why are you referencing this deal here and then telling me I can't do it? What if there's a problem here? What am I supposed to do? And she was just pointing out all of these problems. And then ultimately in the proceedings, she got Hunter to change his answer unequivocally. So in the plea proceeding, she asked Hunter, if you think you're getting immunity, would you sign this plea deal? And he said, yes, I would. And then he went back and the judge went back and broke apart the plea deal. I'm sorry, it was the opposite. She said to Hunter, would you sign this if you didn't have immunity? And he said, no. Okay, so I'm not going to sign that unless it includes immunity. Then they left the courtroom. They came back in. I think what they did is they made it even more corrupt. And they said to the judge that we're just not going to show you the diversion deal. Hunter changed his answer. He came back in and judge said, would you take this deal if you're not granted immunity? And he says, yes, I would, which means now he knows that the DOJ gave him an unspoken, unwritten promise that they're not going to prosecute him. That's why he says, yes, I'll take it. And the judge said, well, I can't let you take it now because now I'm not sure that you knowingly know what you're doing. Because 10 minutes ago, you said hard no. Now you say hard yes. And your lawyers can't even describe how the mechanics are going to work. And so, sorry, this is not a knowingly and voluntary plea deal. So I've got to reject it. And these are very competent people. These are very smart people. All right. This is not an amateur hour mistake. This is maliciousness. These are people who knew what they were doing. They didn't just forget to put a paragraph in somewhere and the judge was just confused. They tried to squeeze this one through, man, and they got busted with their hands in the cookie jar. And then once they got caught, then they started doing this performative little game, like they all got caught. Prosecutors now saying, "Oh no, no, it is an open investigation." Why? Because the judge just got a 900-page document from the House Ways and Means Committee that shows that there's so much more here that it would be unconscionable for Hunter to just simply take a misdemeanor tax deal and a diverted felony gun charge. And so now the prosecutor's saying, no, 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 it's still going on. And then the defense is pounding their table for Hunter's benefit, saying that we can't take this deal if there's no immunity. We thought there was immunity. And so they're doing this big performative piece. And then, the whole thing just broke down. I'm so grateful that it did. It was a scam through and through. And this Judge Norika, she is holding their feet to the fire. And that's just the start of it. I mean, I could go on for hours on this, but I'll pause there just for some breath. But there was also, the day before the trial, before the plea deal, there was a whole nother scandal. So these people are just malicious.
Yeah, no, and I think that this comment right here kind of sums up a lot of what I think about this. As I mentioned before in our previous conversation, when you don't have a guiding legal philosophy, a guiding moral philosophy that informs your legal processes, and you simply refer to precedent and you simply refer to what's been done, and you bow at the altar of tradition, not the altar of moral clarity, then you can easily get things like this. And I personally think it's one of the reasons why we see prosecutorial corruption not only in the federal courts, but also around America as well. It's one of the reasons why. And it's literally built into our system. The fact that the Constitution calls for just compensation when it comes to eminent domain, and yet prosecutors use eminent domain cases all around the country to seize the property without due process and keep it indefinitely. And unless you have hundreds of thousands of dollars and a lot of time to spare, you will never get your stuff back until that prosecutor decides, okay, let you have it. This on literally every level of our system, there is this sort of guiding consequentialist philosophy, which has just harmed our society and harmed our proper sense of legal ethics and moral ethics. And it's why I always go back to saying we need a revolution of the mind in this nation, in this civilization, because the West as a whole has come under assault by these philosophies, which then produce these sort of very bad consequences. And you talk about all this stuff. The founding generation revolted because they were forced to pay a tax on whiskey. This is after the country was established.
Right.
The president had to come out there with all of his men and horses. They still didn't pay the tax. They wouldn't pay the tax until Jefferson got into office and he repealed it. Over whiskey. I can't even imagine what they would have done for this blatant collusion between very powerful families in a justice system, which increasingly behaves like an injustice system. So we really need, again, this is a lot. We really need to get back to a point in our nation where we demand sound philosophy from our leaders. And really, Robert, I think that it all kind of connects. People think that they have no control over it. No, they do. Because you look at how we talk about politics today. Most people talk about politics in a manner that is not deserving of serious consideration. Most folks are very tribalist. They'll say, well, if my candidate gets into office, everything will be okay. They're very tribalist, and they use terms that are also kind of the thought-terminating cliches, like, oh, are you a rhino if you disagree with me? Or, oh, he's a Trojan horse, or he's a plant, oh, he's a Fed, all this kind of stuff, which keeps them in this sort of intellectually inferior strata that prevents them from seeing the bigger picture. And that governs our politics today. And consequently, that impacts the legal system because those who get into power in the legal system are propelled there by politicians elected on the basis of inferior understandings of politics. So I think that it all feeds into each other. It's like a downstream thing. And what you described to me is quite frightening. It's unfortunate. And it's a lot to take in as well. But Yeah, if you have any thoughts about that, we will wrap up soon here because I've had you for almost an hour and a half. So, by the way, I'm incredibly grateful for your time. I'm humbled as well that you decided to come on the channel.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It's been a ton of fun talking to you. And I think what you said, it is concerning. It is scary. It is troubling. I think in some ways it's necessary that we go through this in order to get out, onto the other end of it, because I think that this is not sustainable in its current format. I think that your description of consequentialism is brilliant, and I love how obvious it is. It's in our faces. I mean, the most recent example, I think, was the student loan debacle, where they just decided that we're just going to waive
Yes.
student loans. And we said, well, is there any constitutional underpinning for any of that? And they just said no. And they just did it anyways. And,
Mhm.
that's a very expensive move. It's like when you yell at your significant other, hopefully it's never, but if you yell at an employee or something like that, like sometimes it's warranted, but it's also very, very expensive. It's when you do these things, when you cross that line, when you cross that threshold, there are consequences for that. It's not free money. It's not free executive power. And, I think people are going to start to see that these promises cannot be kept, and that, we'll wake up more people as a result of that. And there may be a situation where we've got two sections of society. We've got the blue team and the not blue team. You've got the CBDC team, the not CBDC team. You've got the lockdown team, you've not got the lockdown team. And so, America might look differently, and we have a long road ahead. I got to tell you, I think guys like Donald Trump are maybe maybe the only man uniquely suited to sort of weather some of this onslaught from a political class, from a partisan hackery political class. And I think that as long as we keep having these conversations, guys like you keep speaking out, and we keep, doing this work supported by, everybody else out there, that I think more people will wake up, and eventually, like, it's like a black hole. The mass of this bureaucracy will collapse in on itself, and the rest of us will be more free as a result of it. And it doesn't come without effort. It comes with a lot of effort. And something that I talk a lot about here is, how do we wake more people up, and how do we not be like the other side? And I shamelessly pull this from 12-step groups, but there's a concept in 12-step groups about attraction versus promotion. There are some entities that do a lot of promotion out there to go get people on their side. Promote, 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 which is really a lot of what the left does. It's a lot of be like us or else, and join this or join that. Whereas I think the better strategy for this long-term play is to build attractive lives, to be attractive people, to do what you're doing, right? Going deeper with philosophy, not having these surface level, bland political conversations where we're all just talking in talking points, but actually exploring these topics, building our minds, building our bodies, building our individual sovereignty, creating communities, and then being cognizant, being aware, just seeing what these people are doing, so that we are not the frog in the boiling pot. And even though, I can lay out a very, I know, doomerish litany of what the DOJ is doing to us, and I got to live with myself too. I get off after the show, I'm like, what the heck did we just talk about there? This is just a disaster. But it is, I think, we're much stronger together, and we're on this journey that is a necessary journey. And as long as we're aware and cognizant of it, I don't think that we're going to be victims of their, of their efforts in the same way that other people might be.
Yeah. Now, the student loan, before we go, student loan debacle. I actually have an intimate connection with that issue. So this is my favorite part of the show. I do this sometimes with some people, so I'll
Sure.
do it here. How old do you think I am, Robert?
Man, I think you're young. I think you're 28.
No,
No?
younger.
Younger? Okay. How,
23.
23? Okay. Chat
Yes,
said Vienti, yeah, so chat says 28. Zach says
23.
38. You're
No,
23?
23.
23, man. You're young, man. That is so great to hear.
Yep.
I'm so happy for that. You are impressive beyond your years, and that's such a positive thing for this country. It's awesome.
No, yeah, no, I think it's the bald head that convinces people that I'm more than I actually am. I kind of just take it in stride though, because no one ever does not take me seriously because of how I look. So, and there are a lot of like young people that get that problem a lot. But no, look, I view this as a calling almost,
Yeah.
because so many people in my generation, they just don't have any care for this. They care about TikTok. They care about, hooking up. They care about status. They care about all kind of things. Yeah, yeah, Gen Z. Having yeah, Gen Z. I I care about philosophy and pursuing higher meaning and understanding issues and things like that. And so, which is why I watch people like you and Robert Barnes and Viva Fry, because I
Yeah.
think you
Great
guys are
guys.
some of the best, especially you, some of the best people to talk about in the legal system. But yeah, no. So the student loan issue. I actually made a video. I put it on my YouTube channel. I put it on Twitter. It got like a million views on Twitter. Like it was like it went big. Hassan Piker, the leftist streamer, responded to me. Very nasty to me, and
Cool.
basically, oh, yeah, it was very, very nasty to me. Very
Yeah,
nasty,
of
attacking
course.
my parents. But basically, I said that Biden's student loan debt forgiveness. The fundamental problem is that it redefines moral relationships in a free society, and that is when you undertake a particular thing, you have an obligation to it, and that's the key. That's like the key facet of being a moral person, respecting the relationship between duty and obligation. We all have moral duties to uphold our oaths and our contracts. If we don't, then things fall apart. You can Every single contract or deal that you get into presumes trustworthiness. But the moment that goes away, the basis for society, which is mutual interaction between two or more people, also goes away. That was my more sort of argument about it. And most of the responses I got had nothing to do with that. People saying that I have an AARP card, people saying that, all kind of just nasty things. It is that's kind of funny. That one's actually kind of funny, actually.
That
but
was hilarious. Yeah.
it's kind of funny. But
So on
yeah,
that,
yeah.
well, I wanted to ask you, so, on that, are you what's the consequence of that, right? So there were millions of people who got the promise of student loans and I would imagine believed in it, right? I never certainly did. I just thought this is all going to go flushed right down the toilet. But what does that do to that relationship between those people and their government?
Well, I think it does several things. I think that when you don't undertake something with the intention of actually being invested in it, you begin to not really value that thing. This is going to be like the more immediate consequence. So if I undertake an investment, so to speak, and I don't I don't really expect to get anything out of that, well, what's the value add for me? Where's my investment in it? What's really at stake for me? So it could create a very slippery understanding of meaning and value in life, because something does not mean the same thing to you if you don't actually have skin in the game for it. That's number one. Number two, I think this is perhaps the more pernicious effect. Universities and the government are wedded in this sort of unholy union to sell a vision of life and society that was only superficially plausible 50 years ago, but now with the increase of the digital age is not
Right.
even necessary. And that vision is white picket fence. You go through all these years of education, government schools, you go in on the government's dime into these educational institutions. And then after that, you go ahead, you go intern or you go live in poverty for X amount of years. Then you go to a company, you work your way up or whatever. And then at age 30, you might have some kids. At age 40 or 50, you might actually have a house full of kids, a white picket fence or whatever. Not even that, just something more stable. Then you'll keep paying off your loans. You'll be in perpetual debt slavery until you die. Well, the devil is a liar, as I said in my church. The devil is a liar. That is not how things have to be.
Right.
You don't have to be running your entire life. You don't have to be enslaved to debt your entire life. Things don't have to be that way. But that is the vision the government and the education system sells people.
Right.
And that's the vision that I was sold. And only recently did I realize it's a bunch of bullshit. Excuse my French.
Mm.
So I'm trying to encourage others to see the world in the same way, because there's no reason in an era where you don't even have to go to college, where you can just make
Right.
money online, that you should be enslaved to debt that enhances the workforce of a political system, its entire existence. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of people that go into these universities and take all this student loan debt out, a lot of them go into the government as well. A lot of them have some
Okay.
kind of government adjacent job. I know a lot of people who are interns on the Capitol Hill or are trying to be involved in like NGOs, which are really not really NGOs. Many of them are just smokescreens for government behavior and society, and they think that they're making an impact that way. No, they're feeding you into the system. They're feeding you into the sewage system, and they're making you think that you need that, which is why I think entrepreneurs are wonderful. And I think that I've learned more from entrepreneurs. I've learned more philosophy from entrepreneurs than I have in all my years in university. So
Right.
those are my thoughts. I think that, yeah, I said a lot there, but yeah, those are my
I,
thoughts.
I agree. I agree with a lot of that. I think that there's a lot of lawyers who are in that space too.
Yeah,
There are lawyers who go to law school and then they go work as a prosecutor or a defense attorney. They get their student loans wiped out in 10 years, based on the forgiveness. And so there's this assembly line, of government to pseudo government, back into government and education, then into unions. So it's very, very commingled. And I agree with you that there's a lot less of a need to do that type of work in this new era. And I think I'm a good example of that. I mean, I used to run a brick and mortar law firm, and now I have exited that world to go into, the digital world. The difference
yeah,
between the world of atoms versus the world of bits, practicing in the court of law versus practicing in the court of public opinion. And I think that there are these parallels in not just law, any institution, right? There's a guy, I think I forget his name. Oh, Roger on YouTube. He's got like 500,000 subscribers. He started as a plumber, he started plumbing and now he's got a plumbing YouTube channel with 500,000 subscribers or something. So,
yeah,
there's just a ton of opportunity. And, I'm constantly encouraging, people, our audience, our community to connect, to, never give up the desire to learn and grow. And let's stay at the forefront of this stuff together, keep studying these issues, because every day we talk about these issues,
hmm
we're learning, we're learning, we're dissecting, we're unpacking. And I'm perfectly okay being wrong in public and falling on my face in public, perfectly fine with that, as long as we're making some progress and talking about these things and
yeah.
hopefully contributing something useful to the country for this next era.
Absolutely. And this is what I'm trying to establish myself as a political commentator, because I do believe there's a deficit of philosophical thinking in the public discussion realm. And if there is any, a lot of it's very haughty and concealed behind obscure language that really just limits understanding, I believe. And I've really been helped along this path by others, some of whom are in the chat right now. I believe in trying to say the most complex thing in the simplest terms possible so that most people can get something out of that. And so I've been working on that myself, but I really believe that's my mission. And so again, when I say that, I'm very humble that you came on this channel and you took time out of your busy day to talk to me, a young guy with a dream. I mean that. Thank you so much.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I love your channel, love your work. Very grateful for the invite. Thank you for sending it over. And I'm glad that we got to have this conversation. We should do it again.
Absolutely. All right. So we got to go. Thank you so much for being here, Robert, and everyone else. Thank you so much for being here. And as I always say, also let me plug two things. We have a Discord channel. We have we have other things as well. I wish I had everything ready. I don't have everything ready. Normally in my videos I have everything ready. We have a Discord channel. We have a locals, christianwatson.locals.com. You guys
Nice.
can join that if you want to. Yeah, was that Rob? What you said?
I said, nice. Yeah, we've got locals too. And I
Yeah.
was just, and I was, yeah, that's great. So like we're on the same platform. So our locals
Yep.
friends say hello to
Yep.
Christian's local friends.
Yep. We got that. And so, yeah, if you guys want to subscribe, you want to like this video, help share it, get it out of there. And Rob, you have anything you want to plug?
Just the normal places, YouTube, Robert Gouveia. We're also on Rumble, Robert Gouveia, locals, watchingthewatchers.locals.com. And, all the other places on Twitter and so on and so forth. And we'll be out there as well.
Yeah. And one last question that was asked in the chat. What are you and your team working on these days? What cases are you working on?
So I'm not practicing law anymore. So I'm just practicing in the court of public opinion, as I say now. So I am currently on our YouTube channel. We're covering the Hunter stuff and the Trump stuff in depth. So we have been, we sort of jump around. We do members only morning streams and we talk about basically everything in the news. But the big cases right now are, of course, the Hunter Biden new case. We thought it was going to be closed as a plea deal. But no, like it's actually going to be an open case now. It was supposed to be open and closed on the same day, but now it's an open case. And so we've got court dates scheduled. We might have pretrial conferences and all sorts of stuff. And then, of course, the other four big cases we're covering are the Trump cases. And so, next week I expect is going to be a very busy one, probably with another indictment coming. And anything political in the law is where our focus is. And so if any of that sounds good, that's what we're up to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, thank everyone for coming here. I appreciate it. And Rob, thank you for coming here. And everybody, please stay pensive. Bye, everyone.